In 331 BC, a 25-year-old king crossed into Persia with an army of roughly 40,000 men and, within a decade, controlled more territory than any human being in history had ever ruled alone. Within 13 years of that crossing, he was dead. Within a generation, his empire had split into 4 warring fragments, and within 2 centuries, almost nothing of it remained intact. 700 years earlier, on a small stretch of land beside the Tiber River, a different kind of expansion had begun. It was slower, less cinematic. For the first 200 years, Rome barely resembled an empire at all. It looked more like a committee that occasionally won local wars. There was no lightning campaign, no singular conqueror, no decade that changed everything. And yet this version of power outlasted Alexander's by roughly 100 times. This is the contradiction sitting at the center of every empire that has ever existed, and almost no one notices it until it's pointed out directly. The empires that expand the fastest through raw military force are, with striking consistency, the ones that collapse the soonest. The empires that expand slowly, awkwardly, almost apologetically, through negotiation, administration, and absorption, are the ones that last for centuries. Alexander won nearly every battle he fought. He never lost a major engagement. By any conventional measure of military genius, he was undefeated. And still, the thing he built didn't survive him by more than a few years. Rome, by contrast, lost battles constantly. It lost entire armies. It lost wars it had every reason to lose permanently. And it kept existing anyway, in one form or another, for the better part of 2,000 years. If conquest were the thing that built empires, this shouldn't be possible. The better army should produce the more durable outcome. Instead, history keeps showing us the opposite pattern, repeated across continents and centuries with almost mechanical consistency. The Mongols conquered faster than almost anyone in history and administered almost nothing, while the structure they left behind evaporated within 100 years of Genghis Khan's death. Meanwhile, empires with mediocre armies and unremarkable generals sometimes lasted longer than anyone had reason to expect. So the question worth asking isn't the one most documentaries ask. It isn't how did this empire win? Almost every empire wins, eventually, somewhere. The question is why winning so rarely seems to be the thing that matters. There's a hidden assumption buried underneath most stories about power. The assumption that the decisive moment is the moment of victory. The flag planted, the city taken, the enemy king kneeling. It's a compelling image, and it's almost always wrong. The decisive moment isn't the conquest. It's what happens the morning after, when the cameras, metaphorically speaking, have already left, and someone has to figure out how 60,000 newly conquered people are going to be fed, taxed, policed, and kept from immediately revolting. That morning after problem is where almost every empire in history has actually been won or lost. And it's a problem that has almost nothing to do with armies. Every empire that has ever existed has produced 2 versions of itself. There's the version built for public consumption, the one carved into monuments, painted on temple walls, recited by court poets, and eventually written into textbooks. And there's the version that actually functioned day to day, which almost never survives in the historical record with the same clarity, because nobody built a monument to a tax ledger. The first version is usually a story about destiny. Rome told itself it was fulfilling a divine mandate to bring order to the world. The British told themselves they were spreading civilization. The Mongols told conquered populations that resistance to Genghis Khan was resistance to the will of heaven itself. Even empires separated by 3,000 years and half the planet tend to reach for strikingly similar language. Chosen people, natural order, historical inevitability, the restoration of peace that only the empire itself can provide. This isn't coincidence, and it isn't laziness. It's function. The official story of an empire is never just decoration. It's infrastructure. A myth of destiny does something a tax collector alone cannot do. It makes extraction feel like participation. It turns a conquered farmer paying grain to a foreign administrator into a subject sharing in the glory of a civilizing project. The story doesn't hide the empire's machinery. It makes the machinery bearable. But here's what's easy to miss the first time you notice this pattern. The myth was never actually running the empire. It was running the empire's reputation. Somewhere underneath the destiny narrative, someone still had to figure out how grain moved from a farm in Egypt to a garrison in Gaul. Someone had to decide which local chieftain got to keep his title in exchange for cooperation, and which one got replaced. Someone had to build the roads that let a message travel from the frontier to the capital in days instead of months. None of that required believing in the empire's destiny. It required something far less glamorous. A working system that could function whether or not anyone believed the myth at all. This is the moment where most historical accounts quietly go wrong. They spend their attention on the story empires told about themselves, because the story is dramatic and quotable and easy to teach. But the story was never the engine. It was the packaging. And if you want to understand why some empires lasted 7 centuries while others barely survived the funeral of their founder, you have to stop reading the packaging and start looking at what was actually inside it. That's where the real architecture of empire begins to reveal itself. Not in what conquerors said about power, but in the unglamorous systems they built to actually hold on to it. Strip away the monuments, the propaganda, the divine mandates, and every empire that has ever endured for more than a generation reveals the same underlying skeleton. Not a story, a system. And that system is built from 3 components so unglamorous that most histories barely mention them: logistics, taxation, and intermediaries. Logistics is the physical problem of moving things, soldiers, grain, information, orders, across distance faster than the empire's enemies or internal rivals can exploit the delay. Taxation is the problem of extracting enough value from a conquered population to fund the empire's operation without extracting so much that the population has nothing left to lose by revolting. Intermediaries are the local individuals, chieftains, priests, merchants, minor nobility, who actually implement imperial rule on the ground, because no empire in history has ever had enough of its own people to directly administer everything it claims to control. Get these 3 things right, and an empire can survive military defeats, incompetent rulers, and even the total collapse of its founding ideology. Get them wrong, and no army, however brilliant, will save it. This is the second empire, the one hiding beneath the official one. It has no interest in glory. It doesn't care about destiny or civilization or the will of heaven. It cares about a single, narrow question, asked continuously, in every province, every year, for as long as the empire exists. Can this territory still be made to pay for itself? Rome answered that question through an administrative system so effective it outlived the Western Empire itself. Provincial governors, standardized taxation, a road network built primarily for military logistics that also happened to accelerate trade and administration across 3 continents. The Mongols, for all their military genius, largely failed to answer it. They were extraordinary at the first empire: conquest, speed, psychological terror, and almost entirely uninterested in building the second one. Genghis Khan's empire was, in administrative terms, barely an empire at all. It was a conquest apparatus without a corresponding system to convert conquest into permanence. This is the distinction the contradiction from Chapter 1 was actually pointing toward. Alexander and the Mongols mastered the first empire, the visible one, the one made of battles and territory and fear. Rome, slower and far less dramatic, mastered the second, the invisible one, made of ledgers, roads, and the quiet daily business of making a system worth maintaining. And once you see this distinction, it becomes almost impossible to unsee. Every empire in history can be measured along this exact line, not by how much territory it took, but by how much of that territory it successfully converted from a battlefield into a bureaucracy. The question that follows is obvious, and it's the one most conquerors never seem to ask themselves in time. What actually happens in the hours after the fighting stops, when the empire has to become something other than an army? Picture the moment right after a city falls. Not the siege, not the battle, the morning after. The walls are breached, the resistance is broken, and the conquering general now controls a population of, say, 60,000 people who spoke a different language yesterday, worship different gods, and answer to a ruler who no longer exists. This is the moment historians tend to skip because nothing photogenic happens in it. There's no battle to describe, no heroic charge, no dramatic betrayal. What happens instead is paperwork. Someone has to decide who collects the grain tax this season. Someone has to figure out whether the local temple keeps its land or loses it. Someone has to determine whether the outgoing administration's officials get executed, exiled, or quietly kept in their positions because, inconveniently, they're the only people who actually know how the local irrigation system works. This is where empires are actually built or destroyed, and it happens almost entirely off camera. The military campaign, however dramatic, is the easy part. Not easy in the sense of low cost, but easy in the sense of conceptual simplicity. Defeat the army, take the city. The rules are relatively clear. What comes after has no such clarity. An occupying force suddenly has to become a functioning government, usually within weeks, using people who don't trust it, in a language many of its own officials don't speak, over territory it may never have physically seen before the invasion began. Most conquerors in history were remarkably good at the first problem and remarkably bad at the second. This asymmetry explains far more about the rise and fall of empires than battlefield tactics ever could. Alexander's generals, the Dacidae, were extraordinary soldiers who inherited an empire they had no idea how to run as anything other than a military occupation. And within a decade of his death, they were fighting each other over the pieces because none of them had built the second empire underneath the first. Rome solved this problem through what might be its single most underrated innovation. It rarely tried to erase the conquered system entirely. Roman administrators frequently kept local elites in power, absorbed local legal customs where convenient, and offered a pathway, however uneven, however slow, toward Roman citizenship itself. Conquest, for Rome, wasn't the end of the process. It was the opening move in a much longer negotiation about who would actually run things tomorrow, and under what terms the conquered would agree to keep cooperating. This is the real fork in the road for every empire that has ever existed. Some conquerors treat victory as the finish line. The empires that last treat it as the starting gun for a much harder and far less glamorous race. The race to build a system that makes the conquered population's cooperation more valuable to them than their resistance. That system has a name, even if the people who built it never called it that. It's called administration, and it runs on 3 specific tools, each of which quietly determines whether an empire survives its own success. Every durable empire in history, regardless of century or continent, ends up building the same 3 tools. Not because they copied each other, but because these are simply the only tools that solve the underlying problem. Distance has to be conquered before territory can be governed. Value has to be extracted without provoking collapse. And someone local has to want the system to keep running. The first tool is logistics, the physical architecture of roads, relay stations, and messenger networks that determine how fast a decision made in the capital can reach the frontier. Rome's road network is famous, but its purpose is often misunderstood. Those roads weren't built primarily for trade, though trade benefited enormously. They were built so a legion could move, a message could travel, and an uprising 3 provinces away could be answered in days rather than months. A road is, in essence, a compressed unit of imperial reaction time. The empires that built them could respond to crises before they became catastrophes. The empires that didn't find out about rebellions only after they'd already succeeded. The second tool is the ledger, taxation refined into a system rather than a raid. The difference between an empire and a very large looting expedition is precisely this. an empire calculates. It figures out, province by province, how much can be extracted this year without destroying next year's harvest or triggering revolt. This sounds mundane, and it is, which is exactly why it's so easily overlooked. A tax system that understands its own limits can fund an empire for centuries. A tax system that doesn't triggers exactly the kind of unrest that ends them. The third tool is the intermediary, and this may be the most important of the three, because no empire in history has ever had enough of its own people to run a conquered territory directly. Rome needed local elites. The Ottomans needed regional governors. The British needed Indian bureaucrats and princely states. The intermediary is the empire's actual point of contact with the governed, and the entire system's legitimacy usually rests on whether that middleman is trusted, feared, or despised. Together, these three tools form something closer to a nervous system than a government. Invisible when functioning correctly, catastrophic when it fails. And their invisibility isn't accidental. It's the entire point. There's a reason none of this made it into the monuments. No emperor ever commissioned a statue of a tax assessor. No triumphal arch was ever built to celebrate a particularly well-designed road maintenance schedule. The machinery of empire had to stay hidden, and not because anyone was ashamed of it. It stayed hidden because visibility would have defeated its own purpose. Think about what a tax collector actually is, stripped of any surrounding narrative. He's a man who arrives, takes a portion of what you grew or made, and leaves, giving you, in exchange, only the promise that he won't come back with soldiers if you resist. Describe this plainly, it sounds less like governance and more like a protection arrangement. And in the most literal sense, it is one. What separates a functioning empire from a criminal enterprise operating at scale is almost entirely a matter of narrative packaging. This is what the official story was actually for. It wasn't there to fool historians centuries later. It was there to fool, or more precisely, to genuinely convince, the population living under the system in real time. When Rome told a conquered province it was joining a civilization rather than being looted by one, that story did real work. It transformed the farmer paying grain to Rome into a citizen contributing to something larger than himself, at least in his own understanding of his situation. The tax was identical either way. The experience of paying it was not. This is why the myth and the machinery were never actually separate systems, despite how differently they functioned. They were two halves of a single design. The machinery extracted the value. The myth made the extraction feel like belonging. Remove the myth, and you're left with something that looks uncomfortably like organized theft, which is precisely why empires that lost their legitimating story tended to collapse far faster than empires that merely lost battles. An empire can survive losing a war. It struggles to survive its subjects concluding, all at once, that the entire arrangement was never anything more than a cost imposed on them by force. This is also why every empire, without exception, invested enormous resources into things that produced no material return whatsoever. Temples, court ceremony, elaborate coronations, official histories written by paid scribes. None of it collected a single coin in tax revenue. All of it existed to answer a single unspoken question circulating among the governed. Why should I keep accepting this? But legitimacy, however carefully manufactured, has never been free. It has to be paid for, maintained, and continuously renewed, and the machinery required to sustain it becomes, over time, an expense in its own right. Which raises the question that every empire in history has eventually had to answer. Usually at the exact moment it stopped being able to avoid it. How much does control actually cost? And what happens when the bill comes due? There's a version of imperial logic that seems, on its surface, unassailable. If control is good, more control must be better. Tighten the grip, station more soldiers, appoint more loyal officials, extract more resources to fund more of the machinery that makes the empire run. It's a reasonable instinct. It's also, almost without exception, the instinct that has ended empires. Control, it turns out, doesn't scale for free. Every additional soldier stationed in a province is a soldier who has to be fed, paid, and housed, usually by that same province. Every additional layer of administration is a layer that has to be funded through taxation, which means extracting more from a population that was already, by definition, conquered and therefore already less inclined to give freely. There's a point, reached differently in every empire, but reached eventually in nearly all of them, where the cost of maintaining control exceeds the value that control is actually producing. This is the structural bind sitting at the center of every empire's long-term survival, and it rarely announces itself dramatically. It shows up first as a budget problem, then as a recruitment problem, when the empire can no longer find enough of its own citizens willing to serve on distant frontiers, then as a loyalty problem, when the soldiers stationed to enforce imperial will are drawn increasingly from the very populations they're meant to be controlling. Populations whose loyalty to the empire's founding myth was always going to be thinner than the founders had been. Rome felt this pressure across centuries in slow motion. By the empire's later years, the legions defending its frontiers were staffed largely by the descendants of conquered peoples rather than Roman citizens from Italy, a system that worked adequately for generations, until it didn't. Because an army's loyalty to an empire it doesn't fully belong to is a different kind of loyalty than an army fighting for its own homeland. This is the tension that sits underneath nearly every account of imperial decline, even when the historical narrative focuses on something more dramatic. A lost battle, a barbarian invasion, a rival empire's rise. Look closely enough at almost any collapse, and you'll usually find this same quiet arithmetic running in the background for decades beforehand. The cost of holding on had been rising faster than the value of what was being held. Loosen the grip, and the periphery drifts, testing how much autonomy it can claim before the center notices. Tighten the grip in response, and the cost of enforcement climbs higher still, often faster than the tax base can support it. There's no permanent solution to this bind. Only degrees of skill in managing it, province by province, generation by generation. And the empires that managed it best were rarely the ones with the strongest armies. They were the ones willing to accept an uncomfortable truth that few conquerors want to hear the height of their power. Sometimes the smartest use of force is choosing not to use it. This is the exact insight that the fastest expanding empires in history have almost universally failed to learn in time. And it's about to become the hinge on which this entire documentary turns. Return, for a moment, to Alexander, not to the battles this time, but to the 13 years between his crossing into Persia and his death in Babylon at 32. In that span, he conquered an empire stretching from Greece to the edge of India, defeating forces that outnumbered his own at nearly every turn. By any measure that counts victories, he is arguably the most successful conqueror who has ever lived. And yet he built almost none of the Second Empire described earlier in this documentary. He appointed governors, yes, often local Persian nobility left in place for administrative convenience. But there was no unified tax structure spanning his territories, no integrated road network connecting Macedonia to Bactria, no long-term system converting conquered populations into invested participants in an ongoing project. What Alexander built was, in the most literal sense, a conquest, an extraordinary, unprecedented conquest, but a conquest without the machinery required to outlive its conqueror. This is why his death didn't just end a reign. It ended the entire structure. Within roughly 2 years, his generals were at war with each other over the pieces. Within a generation, the empire had fractured into competing successor states that would spend the next century fighting over fragments of what he'd built. There was no administrative architecture holding the whole together because there had never been time to build one, and arguably, no intention to. This isn't a story about Alexander's personal failure. It's a structural pattern that shows up whenever conquest outpaces administration. Speed is a military virtue and an administrative liability. An army can move faster than a tax system can be designed. It can conquer a province faster than local elites can be identified, vetted, and incorporated into a functioning government. The very quality that makes rapid conquest possible, overwhelming force applied faster than the enemy can adapt, is precisely the quality that leaves no time to build the invisible machinery an empire needs to survive its founder. Compare this to Rome's expansion across the same rough span of centuries. Rome's early wars were frequently indecisive, sometimes humiliating. The sack of Rome itself by Gallic forces around 390 BC is a case in point. But Rome's expansion across Italy, and later the Mediterranean, unfolded across generations rather than a single lifetime. That slowness, so unglamorous compared to Alexander's blitz across Asia, gave Rome something Alexander's empire never had: time. Time to build roads. Time to develop a legal framework flexible enough to absorb different cultures. Time to let conquered elites see genuine value in becoming Roman rather than merely being ruled by Rome. This is the moment where the contradiction from chapter 1 finally resolves into a principle. It was never really a contradiction at all. It only looked like one. Fast conquest and durable empire aren't two versions of the same achievement. They're two different projects entirely, requiring two different sets of skills, and history has rarely produced a conqueror capable of both. The armies that move fastest are, almost by definition, the armies that haven't stopped long enough to build anything that lasts. Which raises an uncomfortable question for anyone still thinking of empire as a story about winning. What does an empire look like when it barely tries to look like one at all? In 1757, at the Battle of Plassey, a private trading company, not a nation, not a monarch's army, but a commercial corporation headquartered in London, defeated the ruler of Bengal and began a process that would eventually place nearly the entire Indian subcontinent under its control. For decades afterward, the British East India Company governed hundreds of millions of people using a private army, a commercial charter, and a governing style that looked almost nothing like conquest as history had previously understood it. This is one of the strangest and most instructive cases in the entire history of imperial power, precisely because it barely resembled an empire to the people watching it happen. There was no coronation, no triumphant march through a capital declaring a new age. For much of its early expansion, the company insisted, publicly and repeatedly, that it wasn't building an empire at all. It was simply protecting its commercial interests, one treaty and one alliance at a time. That framing wasn't just convenient, it was structural. The company's expansion relied overwhelmingly on local intermediaries, Indian rulers who retained their titles, their courts, and much of their local authority in exchange for accepting British protection, British trade terms, and British political oversight. Entire princely states continued to exist, with their own maharajas and their own internal governance, while the actual levers of taxation, military command, and foreign policy quietly shifted into British hands. From the outside, many of these territories looked unchanged. From the inside, the architecture of who really held power had been completely rebuilt. This is the same principle the Ottoman Empire had discovered centuries earlier through its millet system, which allowed religious and ethnic communities across its vast, multi-ethnic territory to maintain their own courts, laws, and internal leadership, provided they accepted Ottoman taxation and Ottoman political supremacy. The empire didn't need to erase local identity to control local behavior. It needed only to ensure that local identity operated within a structure it ultimately controlled. What both cases reveal is a principle so counterintuitive that most people never arrive at it on their own. The appearance of self-governance is often cheaper and more durable than the reality of direct rule. A conquered population that believes it retains its own institutions, its own leaders, and its own customs is a population with far less reason to revolt than one that watches its entire identity replaced overnight. The empire gets the value, the taxes, the resources, the strategic control, while the conquered population absorbs the psychological cost of believing very little has actually changed. This is, in essence, the most sophisticated version of the Second Empire discussed earlier in this documentary. Not roads and ledgers alone, but a kind of engineered invisibility, a system of control so carefully layered beneath local structures that its own subjects sometimes struggled to identify exactly who was really in charge. And it worked for the company and for the Ottomans alike for a remarkably long time. Not because either was militarily unstoppable, but because both had discovered something Alexander never had the chance to learn. An intermediary who believes he's still in charge is far more valuable and far cheaper to maintain than a subject who knows he isn't. Which leads to the question sitting underneath this entire system, waiting to be asked directly. If intermediaries are the empire's actual point of contact with the governed, what exactly are they being paid with? And what happens to the empire when that currency runs out? No intermediary works for free, and no empire in history has ever paid its local partners in cash alone. What flows from the center to the periphery, in exchange for cooperation, is something closer to a bundle of currencies, status, protection, wealth, and continuity. And understanding this exchange is the closest thing to finding an empire's actual supply chain. Status was often the cheapest currency and the most effective. A local chieftain absorbed into Roman administration might receive Roman citizenship, a formal title, or a seat within the empire's broader hierarchy of honor. This cost the empire almost nothing in material terms, and yet transformed a potential rival into a stakeholder. The same logic ran through British India, where local rulers who cooperated were permitted to retain their courts, their titles, and often their thrones, adorned with British granted honors that meant little practically, but meant everything symbolically to the families who received them. Protection was the second currency, and it was frequently more persuasive than status alone. A local ruler surrounded by rival factions, ambitious neighbors, or internal rebellion often found imperial backing genuinely useful, regardless of how he felt about the empire itself. Being propped up by Rome, or by the East India Company, or by the Ottoman Sultan, could be the difference between holding power and losing it to a domestic rival. In this sense, the empire wasn't only extracting loyalty, it was selling security to elites who had few better alternatives. Wealth was the most direct currency, and also the most volatile. Tax farming, allowing a local intermediary to collect more than the empire required and keep the difference, was a system used from Rome to the Ottomans to British India, and it worked precisely because it aligned the intermediary's personal enrichment with the empire's continued presence. The moment that alignment broke, so did the loyalty it had purchased, and continuity was, in some ways, the quietest currency of all. Empires that allowed local legal systems, religious practices, or cultural institutions to persist were offering something intangible but valuable. The promise that conquest didn't mean erasure. For populations under imperial rule, this promise often mattered more than any single policy, because it suggested that daily life, however altered, would remain recognizable. But every one of these currencies depends on a single condition that empires can control for only so long. The intermediary has to keep believing that cooperation remains more valuable than resistance. That calculation isn't fixed. It shifts with the empire's military strength, its administrative competence, its willingness to actually deliver on the protection or status it promises, and, critically, its ability to keep the whole system feeling worth the cost to everyone involved, not just the center. The moment any of these currencies stops paying out, when status no longer carries real power, when protection fails to materialize during an actual crisis, when tax farming becomes extortion rather than opportunity, the entire architecture built on top of it becomes unstable. And this instability rarely announces itself through open rebellion first. It shows up somewhere much quieter, in an empire's growing inability to adapt to conditions its own founding system was never designed to handle. Empires rarely die of a single wound. They die of an accumulating inability to change, and this is perhaps the most counterintuitive finding in the entire architecture of imperial power, because it means the very systems that made an empire successful are frequently the same systems that eventually destroy it. Consider what a mature imperial administration actually optimizes for. It optimizes for stability, predictability, and the continued functioning of arrangements that have already proven themselves. A tax structure that worked well for a century becomes deeply entrenched, staffed by officials whose careers, families, and status all depend on that structure continuing exactly as it is. A network of local intermediaries who've spent generations building relationships with the imperial center has no incentive to support reforms that might reduce their own influence. An official religion or ideology that legitimizes the empire's founding becomes, over time, a constraint on the empire's ability to respond to new circumstances that the original ideology never anticipated. This is the quiet trap embedded in every successful system of control. Success breeds entrenchment. Entrenchment breeds resistance to change. And resistance to change becomes catastrophic only when circumstances shift faster than the entrenched system can absorb. A new technology, a new economic reality, a rival power organizing itself along fundamentally different lines. Rome's later empire offers a striking illustration. The administrative and military structures that had served the Republic and early empire brilliantly for centuries became, by the 3rd and 4th centuries, a machine increasingly focused on managing its own internal succession crises rather than adapting to the changing military and economic landscape along its frontiers. Provincial administration grew more rigid, not less, even as the threats facing the empire diversified. The very apparatus built to preserve stability became, paradoxically, the thing preventing the empire from evolving quickly enough to meet new kinds of pressure. This is where Chapter 1's contradiction returns, transformed. Rome, remember, was the empire that won by losing, the one that survived catastrophic military defeats because its administrative architecture could absorb the shock and continue functioning. But that same architecture, once fully mature, became something closer to a fortress with no doors. It could withstand external blows remarkably well. It struggled increasingly to change itself from within. This pattern isn't unique to Rome. It appears in nearly every empire that reaches genuine maturity. A system so effective at reproducing its own existing arrangements that it gradually loses the capacity to produce anything else. The intermediaries who once represented flexible, negotiated cooperation become a hereditary class, defending their own privileges. The tax system designed to fund necessary administration becomes a system defending its own continued extraction, regardless of whether the value it produces still justifies the cost. The myth that once made the empire's authority feel legitimate becomes a script recited out of habit, increasingly disconnected from the lived experience of the people still expected to believe it. None of this looks like collapse while it's happening. It looks like stability, the same ceremonies, the same offices, the same official story, repeated with apparent confidence, which is exactly what makes it so dangerous, and exactly why so many empires seem, from the outside, to fall suddenly, when in fact they had already been structurally unable to adapt for decades before anyone noticed. Here is a detail that surprises most people the first time they encounter it. The Western Roman Empire, in its final decades, did not lose to a single decisive military defeat the way Carthage lost to Rome or Persia lost to Alexander. There was no equivalent of a final climactic battle that ended everything in an afternoon. Instead, the empire simply became progressively less able to fund its own armies, administer its own provinces, and coordinate a response to problems it had handled competently for centuries. By the 5th century, Roman authorities were increasingly relying on Germanic groups to defend Roman borders, sometimes as allies, sometimes as settled populations granted land in exchange for military service, in arrangements that blurred the line between defending the empire and becoming its replacement. The Western Empire's formal end in 476 AD, when a Germanic general deposed the last Western emperor, wasn't experienced by most people alive at the time as a cataclysmic rupture. Roman institutions, Roman law, and Roman administrative habits persisted in many regions for generations afterward, absorbed and adapted by the successor kingdoms rather than annihilated by them. This is what imperial collapse actually looks like far more often than popular history suggests. Not a dramatic final battle, but a long accumulation of administrative failures, taxes that could no longer be collected efficiently, provinces that could no longer be defended affordably, intermediaries whose loyalty had quietly shifted because the empire could no longer pay the currencies described earlier in this documentary. The military defeats that do occur near an empire's end are usually symptoms of this deeper exhaustion, not the cause of it. An army that hasn't been paid, supplied, or reinforced properly for a generation was already defeated, structurally, long before it lost its final battle. The same pattern shows up across cultures and centuries with almost unsettling regularity. The Ottoman Empire didn't collapse because a single rival power defeated it outright. It spent its final century losing provinces gradually, as the administrative and economic systems that had once made it competitive fell behind industrializing rivals, and as intermediary relationships across its vast territory slowly frayed. The British Empire didn't lose India in a battle. It lost the calculation, held by millions of people across the subcontinent, that cooperation remained more valuable than independence. A calculation that shifted over decades of economic pressure, political organizing, and the rising cost of maintaining control against a population no longer willing to accept the currencies being offered. This is, in the end, the real shape of imperial decline, and it is almost never the shape presented in the official story. Empires like to remember their endings as tragic defeats, noble resistance against overwhelming odds, a final stand against a stronger enemy. The architecture underneath tells a quieter and more uncomfortable story. The empire didn't fall because someone else became stronger. It fell because it had gradually stopped being able to pay for its own existence in every currency that mattered, until the system that had once made it powerful simply stopped functioning. And here is the detail that makes this pattern worth carrying forward, out of the history books and into the present. Nobody plants flags anymore. Nobody declares a new empire in the language Rome or Britain once used. And yet the underlying architecture, a center, a periphery, intermediaries, extracted value flowing inward, legitimacy flowing outward, never actually disappeared. It simply stopped needing a flag to function. Somewhere in the last century, the empire stopped needing a throne. This isn't a claim about any particular government or corporation. It's an observation about architecture, the same three-part structure this documentary has traced across Rome, the Mongols, the East India Company, and the Ottomans, still fully operational, just no longer wearing the uniform that used to make it recognizable. Consider what a multinational corporation actually is, stripped of its modern packaging the same way Chapter 2 stripped the packaging off ancient empires. A center, often headquartered in a wealthy nation, extracts value from operations spread across dozens of countries. Local intermediaries, regional executives, licensed distributors, franchise partners, implement the center strategy on the ground, because no corporation, any more than any ancient empire, has enough of its own people to run everything directly. Legitimacy flows outward through a story. Innovation, opportunity, global connection, progress. Value flows inward through mechanisms far more sophisticated than a Roman tax collector, but functionally similar in purpose. None of this requires conquest. It requires only what the East India Company and the Ottoman millet system discovered centuries earlier, that a population willing to believe it retains its own agency, its own institutions, its own meaningful choices, is a population that will cooperate with far less friction than one that feels directly ruled. A government doesn't need to be occupied to fall within an economic center's sphere of extraction. A local business doesn't need to be seized to become dependent on a platform's terms of access. The architecture doesn't announce itself because, as Chapter 6 established, it never needed to. Invisibility was always the design, not a modern innovation. The reserve currency of a dominant economic power functions, in some respects, like the Roman road network, an infrastructure that accelerates the center's ability to project influence, extract value, and respond faster than rivals operating without equivalent infrastructure. A dominant technology platform's relationship with the smaller businesses and creators who depend on its infrastructure echoes the intermediary relationships described in Chapter 10 with uncomfortable precision. Currencies of status, visibility, and access, offered in exchange for cooperation, withdrawn the moment that cooperation becomes inconvenient for the center. None of this is a conspiracy. That's precisely the point. And it's the point this documentary has been building toward from its opening contradiction. Empires were never sustained by secret cabals plotting in shadows. They were sustained by systems so effective at aligning incentives, for administrators, for intermediaries, for populations who found cooperation more rewarding than resistance, that almost no central coordination was required to keep them running. The architecture doesn't need a conspiracy. It only needs enough people, at every level, finding it easier to participate than to resist. This is why the pattern keeps resurfacing across radically different eras, technologies, and ideologies, without anyone deliberately copying the Roman model. It isn't being copied. It's being rediscovered, independently, every time a center of power needs to control a periphery larger than itself, because the underlying problem, distance, extraction, legitimacy, cost, never actually changes. Only the vocabulary does. And if the architecture never really disappeared, then the question this documentary has been circling from its very first sentence deserves one final answer. Not about Rome or Alexander or the East India Company, but about what all of it, together, actually reveals about power itself. Return, one final time, to the image this documentary opened with: a 25-year-old king crossing into Persia, undefeated in battle, dead within 13 years, his empire dissolved within a generation. Set beside it, a small settlement on the Tiber, expanding so slowly for its first 2 centuries that it barely resembled a power at all, and yet still shaping law, language, and governance on 3 continents nearly 2,000 years later. The contradiction between them was never really a contradiction. It was a distinction between 2 entirely different projects wearing the same name. Conquest is the art of taking. Empire is the art of keeping. And keeping has almost nothing to do with the qualities that make conquest possible. It requires roads instead of cavalry charges, ledgers instead of sieges, intermediaries willing to believe cooperation serves them, instead of enemies forced into submission. It requires, above all, patience with something conquerors rarely have patience for: the slow, unglamorous work of building a system that doesn't need the conqueror to keep functioning. Every layer of this documentary has uncovered connects back to that single distinction. The official story, destiny, civilization, the will of heaven, was never the empire itself. It was the packaging that made extraction feel like belonging, built to answer a question every subject population eventually asks, whether consciously or not: why should I keep accepting this arrangement? Beneath that packaging sat the second empire, the invisible one, built from logistics, taxation, and intermediaries, 3 unglamorous tools that determined, far more than any battle, whether a conquest became a civilization or dissolved back into the territory it had briefly occupied. That architecture had a cost, and the cost scaled with control. Tighten the grip, and the bill arrives faster. Loosen it, and the periphery drifts. No empire in history solved this tension permanently. They only managed it more or less skillfully, for as long as their systems remained capable of adapting to conditions the founders never anticipated. And when that adaptive capacity finally ran out, the ending rarely looked like the dramatic defeat the official story had always promised. It looked like exhaustion, a currency of loyalty that stopped paying out, an administration that had optimized itself into rigidity, a collapse assembled gradually out of 1,000 small failures to change, long before anyone recognized it as a collapse at all. And the architecture didn't end there, because it was never really about crowns or flags to begin with. It was about a structural problem. How does a center sustain influence over a periphery larger than itself, that every era rediscovers independently, using whatever tools happen to be available? Rome used roads and citizenship. The Ottomans used the millet system. The East India Company used shareholders and sepoys. What operates today uses different instruments entirely, but answers to the exact same underlying logic, because the logic was never tied to any particular century. This is the deeper subject this documentary was actually about, hiding beneath a title that promised only history. Not how empires were built, how power, in any era, converts a moment of advantage into something that outlives the moment, and why the systems capable of doing that have always looked less like triumph and more like quiet, patient architecture, built by people history rarely remembers, in rooms no monument was ever raised to commemorate. Empires like to be remembered by their conquests, because conquest is the part that photographs, well, the crossed river, the fallen city, the crown taken by force. But nothing in the historical record suggests that conquest was ever the mechanism of their survival. It was, at best, the opening move in a much longer and far less dramatic negotiation, conducted continuously in every province, between a center that needed cooperation and a periphery that needed a reason to give it. What actually determined whether an empire lasted 7 years or 7 centuries was never the size of its army at the moment of victory. It was the durability of a system built afterward, largely by people whose names were never recorded. The administrators who decided how much a province could be taxed without breaking it. The intermediaries who calculated, year after year, whether cooperation still served them better than resistance. The quiet architects of roads and ledgers who understood, correctly, that holding power requires an entirely different skill set than acquiring it. This is not a pattern confined to Rome or Persia or the empires this documentary has walked through. It is the pattern underneath the very idea of durable power in any form it happens to take. Systems that can convert a single advantage into a self-sustaining structure outlast systems built only to win. And systems that stop being able to adapt, no matter how impressive they once were, no matter how total their control once seemed, begin dying long before anyone notices, in the quiet erosion of arrangements too rigid to bend. History rarely repeats itself in the same form. What repeats are the structures that reward certain behaviors, preserve certain institutions, and quietly shape the choices people believe they are making freely. The names change. The uniforms change. The architecture rarely does.